Well, thank you, Skip, and thanks for everybody coming out here. Especially happy to see several former employees of the Rock Island Railroad here as well. Anytime I'm in this building, I have covered a lot of news events here, and it doesn't matter whether it's world leaders or former President Clinton. Every time I come in here, I just sit back and kind of take in the awe of this building, the number of people who passed through here, all the things that happened here over the 70 years that this was a major train station. So I guess I'll start by saying the state that this building is in now is a stark contrast from the way the building looked when I first started coming out here. This is pretty much what this building looked like there on the left. The building had been boarded up for about 25 years. The track ended just before you got to the bridge, and that's a 2nd Street overpass that you see there. That was removed in the mid-1990s. But at that time, this area was essentially a large homeless camp. When you think about what the area that is today the River Market is like, that then was essentially boarded up and abandoned warehouses. And this was part of town not many people really came over to. So I'll back up and tell you a little bit of how I first became interested in the Rock Island. I was in 2nd grade when I was bused to Redwood Elementary. At that time, as part of the ongoing desegregation efforts in North Little Rock, every 3rd year you would be bused to another school outside of your area. And in 2nd grade, the school year that began in the fall of 1979, I was bused to Redwood Elementary. If you're not familiar with it, that's just a couple of blocks off of Broadway, not too far down the line from here. Right in front of the school was the busy main line for the Rock Island Railroad. And this was just before the Rock Island shut down. I used to watch the trains go by. I'd hear the horn of the trains blasting while I was in class. When I was in recess, I'd go over to the edge of my schoolyard and watch the trains. Even had my teacher let me go over to the window, during art class or times like that, and I'd just watch the trains go by. Like most kids, I had been interested in railroads, but I'd primarily been exposed to the Missouri Pacific up until that point. So to see the Rock Island trains coming by, I quickly became a fan of the Rock Island. But what I didn't know at the time was that it was a time of great upheaval for the Rock Island. The railroad had filed for bankruptcy in 1975, and at that time they were getting ready to go on strike. There were a lot of circumstances that came together that led to the railroad to be struggling at this point, and I'll get into those a little later, but essentially you had creditors who were saying that the Rock Island was worth more dead than alive. It was a struggling era for railroads, and a federal judge eventually went along with their creditors and said, yes, let's shut down the Rock Island, let's liquidate it. And for me, being in 2nd grade, suddenly I noticed the train stopped going by in front of my school. Grass started growing through the rails, and it kind of struck a nerve with me. A few years past, the railroad station here had essentially been shut down since about 1968, but the track was still in use. The Arkansas River Bridge was still in use at that point. And looking out at the bridge out there, I used to notice a lot of traffic, trains crossing the bridge, whenever I was a kid, my family would cross I-30, and I'd look over. The lift span was usually down, and you saw a lot more trains over on the Rock Island Bridge than you saw on the Junction Bridge, the one that's on the other side of I-30. At a certain point, I noticed I never saw the lift span down anymore over the years. And by the time I got to high school, I was curious what had become. Was the bridge even in use anymore? And that's when I started coming over here. That's when I found essentially this was the situation at the time. The bridge, it had last been used in 1984. There's a railroad historian I worked with named Dr. Bill Pollard. There's been some debate about when the bridge was last used for trains, but he told me that the Little Rock and Western, a small railroad that was formed to operate part of the track between Little Rock and Danville, continued to use the Rock Island Bridge until 1984, until there was a spur built over by Union Station, the Missouri Pacific track, to give them an easier connection so that they could connect and go over to the North Little Rock yard there to interchange cars. But he said he rode across a few trains of the Little Rock Western and is confident that's when the bridge was last used. After that, the electricity was cut off to the bridge. It was locked in the up position, and by the time I came out here, the bridge hadn't been used in 4 years. The track actually ended just beyond the train station here. There was a crossing where Missouri Pacific at that time crossed there, but the track was taken up through the bridge. And when I came out here at that time, there was nothing to stop anyone from just walking out onto the bridge. And I wanted to know more of what happened, kind of what led to the railroad ending up in this situation. So when I was a junior in high school that year for English, you had to write a research paper. So I decided to make my topic the Rock Island Railroad. And that's how I started what's essentially been now 29 years worth of research, off and on in different phases. But that's when, for the first time, I started reading up on the railroad. I went over to the Arkansas Gazette building, read clip files, and started trying to learn as much as I could about the railroad. Another source you could use for your research paper was doing a live interview. My best friend in high school, her dad worked for the Rock Island, a guy named Joe Rook. He went by the name, everyone in the Rock Island pretty much had a nickname, and his nickname was Buzzy. He gave me some information about the railroad. He talked with me about the situation, but he didn't necessarily want to be interviewed. He told me there's another guy you ought to talk to, someone who really likes to talk. His name was L.T. Walker, and he had worked for the Rock Island since 1942, had retired in 1978 just before the Rock Island shut down. And so I went over to talk with him. And I thought it'd be a brief interview, maybe a half hour, but I learned he really liked to talk. And one story led to another, and he'd finished one story, and then there was another time we were double-headed out of Boonville, and just the stories were incredible. We ended up sitting down for about 3 hours. I had just started working in radio at the time, so I thought I would record it. I brought my microphone and a recorder over to his house. I brought 2 blank 90-minute tapes, and finally I was like, well, my second tape's about to run out. But he gave me such good material, and I held on to those tapes for years. I used a short quote that he told me in my paper, but I didn't know what to do with all of these stories he told me. About 14 years after that, in 2002, I was working to put together a website, kind of a portfolio website on my career up at that point, and I included a lot of audio of some of the more noteworthy stories I had reported on. And I thought, well, let me put these stories out there. You know, I've been holding on to these tapes, and they're great material. LT had died in, I think, 1999. So I thought, this is really just incredible. So I put that out there, and it got a huge response. I found out how many people really loved LT Walker. There was a guy here in Central Arkansas who was head of the Arkansas Railroad Club. He published a magazine called Arkansas Railroader. He put a link to my story on his website, and suddenly I started getting all this traffic from people listening to these stories by LT. And that's how I came to find out that, recording oral histories and documenting people's stories wasn't necessarily anything new, but I hadn't found anything like this for railroad workers. And it made me think I need to do more to document these stories. The Rock Island shut down in 1980, and the numbers of former employees were dwindling fast. Thanks a lot. Thankfully, there are still a lot of people around, but their numbers are shrinking. So I interviewed a few more people there in the mid-2000s. My friend's dad, Joe Rook, I finally convinced him to let me interview him, and talked to him in December of 2003 and again in December of 2004. And I'll then fast forward to today. I started working on this book about 2 years ago, and the goal for the book, obviously, this is a collection of photos, but I thought at the same time, since I was talking to so many former railroad employees, I ought to try to record as many stories as I can. So since I've started working on this book, I've been recording more stories, and as Skip mentioned, I'm working on a podcast series. I'm also posting just the full, complete interviews on my website. I'm working to rebuild my website right now. It was a little outdated by modern standards, so I've been doing it on a new platform, but I'm just now starting the process. I've been indexing these interviews for the last couple of months, and am looking to get the first episode produced by the end of this coming weekend, and hopefully get a new episode produced every 2 or 3 months. But back to the Rock Island itself, I'll share a little history on the railroad. A lot of you may already know this, but a little bit of what I've taken from my research into this, and especially in Arkansas. The Rock Island, there's been a lot written about the Rock Island nationally, but I found there wasn't very much specific to Arkansas. And Arkansas, unlike a lot of states, the tracks that were once used by the Rock Island were largely abandoned and eventually taken up. You have a few small stretches where the track is used, but you don't have that main line crossing the state as it once did, going from Memphis, crossing Arkansas from east to west, going through Little Rock, and eventually getting to Tucumcari, New Mexico. And it ran trains from Memphis to Amarillo. So because there was so little about the Arkansas side of this, that's been the focus, really, of my research. And first, I'll start with the Choctaw, Oklahoma, and Gulf, the railroad that built this incredible depot between 1898 and 1899. That's the company that built the Arkansas River Bridge. Amazing to think that this building and that bridge are 118 years old, and that they survived many years of abandonment. That shows just how well they were constructed. But the Choctaw, Oklahoma, and Gulf, it was created with the goal of linking coal that was available in Oklahoma with the Mississippi River in Memphis. And that was the real driving goal with the creation of this railroad. The company absorbed the first chartered railroad in Arkansas, which was the Memphis and Little Rock Railroad, which had been created, I think, around the time of the Civil War. But there, toward the end of the 1800s, the Choctaw, Oklahoma, and Gulf was organized and decided we need to expand beyond Little Rock and wanted to extend all the way into Oklahoma. The headquarters for the Choctaw, Oklahoma, and Gulf was used to be right next door to this building. Some of you, if you know much about history of Little Rock, there was a building there called the George House. It was the home for originally one of the richest residents in Little Rock, Alexander George. When the Choctaw, Oklahoma, and Gulf was created, they bought that building. It had previous to that served as the first Catholic hospital in Arkansas, but it was an incredible building right next door, and it ended up being torn down in the early 1990s. But that was headquarters for the railroad. They also then extended the track on out. But this area was essentially the headquarters. Not only did you have the passenger station here, the headquarters next door, there was the original freight depot right across the tracks, and at that time, the rail yard for it was over in North Little Rock. At a certain point, especially after World War II, all railroads began to struggle for a number of reasons. After World War II, cities began expanding into the suburbs. You had construction of highways, and in particular the interstate system, which got a lot of federal dollars. And so you had not only passengers who were being taken away from the railroad, but you had a lot more people opting to drive. You also had freight now being shipped instead by trucks. And you also had the growth of the airline industry. And people started changing about how they didn't want to, say if they were going to go across the country, sit on a train for a couple of days. And so railroads saw a big loss of traffic in that time. The railroad attempted to compete, and they improved passenger service. And I'll show you first here. This is the huge footprint that the Rock Island had in Arkansas. This is in the book, but this is all the cities that were served by the railroad. It had an incredible footprint. And the one going from Memphis all the way west to the Oklahoma line, that was the key artery for the Rock Island. That was part of what they called the Sun Belt route. Then they also had these branch lines, and they also had part of it that went down to El Dorado and into Louisiana. But this shows what an impact the railroad had in the state. And as it began to struggle, that's when a lot of these communities became concerned. Skip mentioned the Confederate Veterans Reunion in 1911 that drew so many people. This was one of the biggest events, it was the biggest event for the city up until that time. This was a parade that was taking place. And if you look right in front of the guy on the horse, you'll see the downtown ticket office for the Rock Island lines. I think this was on Main Street. Most of the railroads did have downtown ticket offices, and that was the one for the Rock Island. But with the wars that occurred, the railroads played a key part in the war effort. These stations for World War I and World War II, these were where so many passengers left to go off and fight, where they saw their families for the last time. The military used troop trains mainly up until that point to get people around. This was where the soldiers, if they came back home, this was where they were greeted by their relatives. If they were killed in combat, the train stations, this is where the relatives would come out to claim the bodies. When you think about the level of emotion that just happened here, and just the sheer number of people who passed by, it's very striking. But after World War II, as I mentioned, the railroads began to struggle. People weren't taking trains as much. So the Rock Island, like other railroads, attempted to have more first-class passenger service. And for the Rock Island, they started their what they called rocket trains. And this is the Choctaw rocket that ran from Memphis to Amarillo, Texas. First-class travel options. You had nice meals. This is in Little Rock. In fact, that's the 3rd Street Bridge in the background, the same 3rd Street Bridge that is still there today when it changes over to Markham, over by the Deaf and Blind School. But you didn't have a lot of people. Railroads were still struggling, and eventually they cut back on the trains, and before long, they cut back to the RDC cars, or what they nicknamed doodlebugs. They were essentially one-car trains. They did have enough power if it was a busy travel period where they could attach a passenger coach to it. But essentially, yes, it's about like a bus on rails. The key thing, though, that still made these trains profitable for the Rock Island was the mail contract that they had for the U.S. Postal Service, picking up packages and mail along the way. And it was when the U.S. Postal Service decided to do away with the U.S. mail being transported by train. It was almost immediate that as soon as they got approval from the Interstate Commerce Commission, the Rock Island then ended passenger service. And the last train to come through the Little Rock station here, the last regular passenger train, was on November 10th, 1967. And this is that last westbound train. The historian I worked with, Dr. Bill Pollard, he works as a dentist out of Conway, but just very much passionate about the history of the state. He was fairly young at this time, but he knew this was coming, and he went out here to the train station to make sure he documented this last train. This was going to be a crew changeover, and he got the inbound and the outbound crew together to take this photo. He didn't take it with a flash. He was using slow-speed Kodachrome film and with long exposure times, and using a tripod, and took this photo. That's the crew there. The little boy you see there, that's Bill Pollard's kid brother, Alan Pollard, who he brought out with him. Bill Pollard gets a lot of credit for coming out and documenting the last breaths of the Rock Island in this state. His real passion was the Missouri Pacific, but he met a lot of friends who convinced him of the importance of the Rock Island, and so that's how he started documenting the railroad. And I interviewed him for my podcast series too, so you can hear in that he describes the mood here as very somber. The ticket office was going to close, and it was shortly after this moment that this train station was abandoned and would remain for the next 25 years. The conductors and brakemen you see here, or firemen, they had seniority, so they wouldn't be losing their jobs, but they would have to bump back into freight service. A lot of employees, especially the older ones, liked working the passenger trains. It wasn't as hard as doing freight service where you're out there switching cars. mainly for the conductors. You just had to keep track of where people were going. But some people didn't like working the passenger service. In fact, my friend's dad, Joe Rook, told me he didn't like it. He had worked as a conductor because you'd be away from home for so much. He said he'd be gone for 3 days at a time. He'd get on the train at night heading west to Boonville. He'd have to spend the night and the next day in Boonville, then take the next passenger train heading east, come across Arkansas, go all the way to Memphis, spend the day and a night there, and then come back. So he said he didn't like the passenger service because he was away from his family for so much. So that's why a lot of people preferred doing the freight service. But one thing Bill Pollard told me was that despite this scene, despite this being so sad, neither he nor anyone else out there on the platform had any idea that 13 years later, the railroad itself would be gone. So, what went wrong? How did the railroad end up in this shape and shutting down 13 years later? I'll try not to get too into the weeds in this because it is a very complicated story. But by the end of the 1950s, revenue, traffic, passenger, and freight service were flat. Costs were increasing. And the Rock Island decided what it needed to do was to find a partner to merge with, and started talking with different railroads. At this time, the regulations for the railroad industry were still fairly onerous, hadn't really changed in decades, at a time when so much had changed for other transportation options. And in 1964, the Rock Island announced it was going to merge with Union Pacific, or at least they wanted to. And the Union Pacific would acquire much of the Rock Island trackage, but the southern property would be sold. First, they said to Southern Pacific, and then later there was talk about the Santa Fe picking that up. But there was a lot of opposition to creation of what would be a huge railroad, a national network stretching from Chicago in the Midwest all the way out to the West Coast. And I mentioned Union Pacific, but at that time Union Pacific was not in Arkansas. You had the Missouri Pacific. Later, the Union Pacific did merge with the Missouri Pacific, but at that time, Union Pacific and Rock Island wanted to merge. That started what is said to have been the longest, most complicated merger ever considered by the Interstate Commerce Commission. And the Rock Island essentially stopped investing in its infrastructure. It stopped putting in money into track maintenance. Tracks have to be maintained constantly. You have the ties that rot, you have rails that broken, and you can do a short-term patch, but essentially they needed to be welded, and you just had the track go downhill really quickly. And with that, you had slow orders on a lot of parts of the railroad where they couldn't go more than, say, 10 miles per hour. Derailments started happening constantly. And finally, after 10 years of consideration by the ICC, they approved the merger. But Union Pacific looked at the condition of the track, the infrastructure, the equipment, the rolling stock, and said, we don't want it anymore. It would cost too much money to rebuild this, to bring it up to speed, and just walked away from the deal. At that time, the Union Pacific, the Rock Island, almost immediately went into bankruptcy in 1975. It was its third time in bankruptcy, but most people thought it would eventually emerge. Railroads had gone into bankruptcy before. The Rock Island had been in bankruptcy, I think, twice before that. And the thought was they would go into bankruptcy, maybe negotiate with the unions, get some concessions, and would eventually be able to merge. The Rock Island did get a lot of federal money to reopen a car shop at Biddle. This was rebuilding mainly hopper cars, and these were needed to help move grain service, get crops or agricultural commodities to market. And so they were able to reopen this car shop over at Biddle Yard, which is the yard over in South Little Rock, over there by Roosevelt. And it kept going for 5 more years. But the key thing was no money went into the track. And that's where a lot of Rock Island employees say the real mistake happened, and what really killed the Rock Island. By 1979, the railroad was in dire condition, and 5 years before that, as it first entered bankruptcy, many members agreed to take a 10% pay cut just to help the struggling railroad. They knew the dire situation it was in, and they felt like the railroad would eventually get back on its feet. But that didn't happen, and by 79, you had some union politics that came into play. You had employees who were due back wages. You had expired labor contracts, and a lot of people didn't feel the railroad was making enough progress. There was also some national union management that had lost some big fights with other railroads, and the stories I hear were pretty much that the national management wanted to really make a stand with the Rock Island. Eventually, it was decided the Rock Island would go out on strike, and that was in the fall of 1979, and things really began to struggle from there. Management attempted to keep the trains rolling, but it was tough to do. In Arkansas, this was a major crisis, and one of the more interesting things that in my research, I was able to go through the files of the governor at the time, a young guy named Bill Clinton, who was serving his first term in office. And they made a point to keep a huge file of everything that was happening with the railroad. So I was able to last year sort through all these documents, all these internal memos, the letters that the governor's office was getting from mayors of towns who were concerned about what was happening. You also had the unions, of course, were sending letters. You had employees who were concerned about it. But this was really a major crisis because the Rock Island employed 700 people in Arkansas. It had industries along the tracks, especially places like Boonville, towns that weren't served by other railroads that didn't have immediate access to an interstate. Boonville had a couple of companies that had several hundred employees each, and said, if the Rock Island shuts down, or if we can't get trains in and out with what we need, then we're going to have to leave. One of the most interesting items was this. This was a Western Union item sent by Governor Clinton to President Jimmy Carter. And I'll read just a little bit of this. Unless an accord is reached, and soon, it is a certainty that employees will be laid off indefinitely, perhaps permanently. Factories serviced by the Rock Island will shut down. Products, especially rice, which are now being harvested, will be unable to reach markets, creating immediate hardships for our farmers and future hardships for our consumers. Rock Island employees, many of whom do not support the strike, will find themselves without a job if the railroad is forced to abandon its line in the state. President Carter ordered the unions back to work, and the unions ignored that. So as all of this was playing out, you had creditors for the Rock Island. In particular, there was a guy named Henry Crown who was advocating for the railroad to be shut down, said it was worth more dead than alive, and was asking a federal judge to shut it down, to liquidate it, and that's exactly what a judge ended up doing. I believe it was January of 1980, and a final date was set for the Rock Island, and I think I have that here. Well, this is actually another photo from the years heading up to it. You can see the rough shape of the depot, but this was actually a Stuttgart local. They called it the Riceland Rocket for the major company out there at the end of the Stuttgart branch. But this was the last day of operations for the Rock Island. There are actually really two dates, but this was the main one. This was March 23rd, 1980, after the judge had ordered the railroad be shut down. This photo ran in the front page of the Arkansas Gazette, and I appreciate the Arkansas Democrat Gazette letting me use it in this photo. But that last day of operations for the railroad, Dr. Bill Pollard was out there. He too was taking photos. He said it was just a miserable day. It was rainy, cold, and everybody's getting ready for it to be shut down. The trains were fewer and fewer. You had the railroad moving its cars to central locations, getting ready to move them out to other gathering yards. Then the Cotton Belt took over the Rock Island for 90 days after this happened. The track to the west of Little Rock, I believe it shut down on March 30th, 1980. So then began the struggle of what do you do with the track. There had been efforts to try to get other railroads interested in purchasing the Rock Island track in Arkansas. In other states, railroads did move in, or in some places, I think Oklahoma came in where the state actually purchased the track and leased it out. It was still, despite the rough condition, it would have been ideal for railroads that were attempting to expand at this time. Part of the irony is that I mentioned the federal regulations were rather onerous, but shortly after the Rock Island shut down, later in 1980, was passage of what's called the Staggers Rail Act, which allowed for a great deregulation of the railroad industry and made the industry a little more profitable. And it was after that you did see a lot of expansion. You saw the Union Pacific decide to instead acquire the Missouri Pacific. And later there would be other major mergers, Burlington Northern and Santa Fe. The Union Pacific would eventually acquire the Cotton Belt. But in the years immediately after the Rock Island shut down, they struggled. They tried to find another company to come in and actually buy the trackage in Arkansas. And other than a few small stretches, they were not able to do it. The papers that I read in the governor's office showed that part of the problem was, yes, the track was in terrible shape. It would have taken millions to rehabilitate. But there were also concerns about union obligations, like having to hire Rock Island employees, maybe pay back wages. That had attorneys for other railroads concerned about taking this on, and there would be a big liability. And eventually it became clear that another railroad wasn't going to acquire the property, at least as a whole, in Arkansas. That's when you had the state consider a plan that was proposed by a state lawmaker, Lloyd George of Danville. That was one of the main towns affected by the Rock Island west of Little Rock. He proposed the state buy the trackage and then lease it out to companies, or at least hold on to it for a while. And that was debated in the legislature. You had former employees, like my friend's dad, Joe Rook, went over to the Capitol, tried to convince lawmakers of the value of this plan. But you also had heavy lobbying by the competition. The other major railroads in the state, the Missouri Pacific and the Cotton Belt, didn't want to allow someone like the Santa Fe to come in and wanted to not have the competition. So it's part of, there had long been an argument about going back at least to the 50s about what they said was the redundancy of a lot of railroads in the country, that a lot of the same railroads served the same areas, and that for the industry to survive, we needed to kind of, narrow that down a little bit, not have as much. But only a few small stretches, as I said, were acquired in Arkansas. You had from Little Rock west, a short line railroad was formed called the Little Rock Western to serve a couple of major industries as far as the Danville area. Though I hear it's essentially on borrowed time because the industries there have been dwindling, and it's also a railroad that doesn't really go anywhere. It's not a major through railroad like you see elsewhere, so it doesn't have a lot of benefits. You had the Rock Island stretch that went off toward Hot Springs. There's still some industry there, and you have a small railroad there, the Arkansas Midland Railroad. And then you have a stretch of what was the main line that ran between Little Rock and Memphis. They run between Brinkley and Memphis, a stretch of the original main line. That's now used by Union Pacific. It had been acquired by Cotton Belt, and it never went down and never deteriorated because the Cotton Belt had trackage rights over that stretch of track. It was shared even between the Cotton Belt and the Rock Island. But otherwise, except for, there are a couple of small places, maybe down around Fordyce, but you don't have railroads that came in. Finally, when it didn't look like there was any hope for it, by about 1984, a salvage company came in and took up the remaining rails in Arkansas, west of the Danville area through Boonville, all the way to the Oklahoma border. The rails were taken up and sold for scrap. And that's pretty much, by the time I started researching the railroad, the state of things. So I think the only thing I'll add beyond that is just the history of these particular spots right here in Little Rock. This depot remained empty, abandoned, boarded up until the early 1990s. At a certain point, a restaurant chain, Spaghetti Warehouse, came in, invested millions of dollars in renovating it, and they turned it into a restaurant. That was before the River Market. It was before you really had many people coming out to this part of town, and it only lasted a few years, but it at least preserved this structure. One other person who should get some credit for helping to preserve this building, even though it was boarded up at this time, the owner of the Arkansas Gazette, Hugh Patterson. The Arkansas Gazette bought several acres of property in the mid-'60s, and their printing press for the Arkansas Democrat-Gazette is right over there. They bought a large chunk of the property, which included this building and the George House. And while they didn't do any renovation work with it, the historian I worked with, Bill Pollard, said that they get a lot of credit for boarding it up and really protecting an eye on this building and just making sure someone was watching out for it, the people over there at the printing press. Hugh Patterson had more than an interest in railroad history, so he gets a lot of credit. But finally, the bridge, there had been a plan for the bridge to be taken down by the Union Pacific, and the first time I came out here, I went out a little bit on the bridge, but not too far. But by the mid-1990s, Union Pacific was still adamant that they were going to tear down this bridge. They deemed it a liability. It wasn't in use. They had two other bridges across the river here. So at that point, I started trespassing all over that bridge. I actually came out here like about 1994. I was in a photography class in college at the time, and I wanted to document that bridge before it was gone. So not only did I walk out there, I also got into the internal ladders where you could climb up to the upper lift span. There's the machinery house up on the lift span. I crawled through every spot on this bridge. It was pretty dangerous and probably, somewhat stupid, but I wanted to see it. I was careful. I know I did meet with someone who worked for an ambulance company here last year who told me they had many rescues out here of people falling off this bridge. And you never knew who you'd run out to. Homeless people even would be out there. But a lot of credit goes to the foresight of people like Pulaski County Judge Buddy Valines, Little Rock Mayor Jim Daly, North Little Rock's Pat Hayes, who started a campaign to save the bridge. Even though they couldn't renovate it at the time, they at least said, we need to mothball this, at least preserve it until something could be done with it. And eventually, the Clinton Presidential Library, this was selected as the site. It took a lot longer. They hoped to have the bridge completed in time for the library's opening in 2004. Took another 7 years. The cost was, I think, double what it was originally. It ended up costing $11 million to renovate the bridge. But eventually they did it, and it's just great to come out here, see that these buildings, or this building and the bridge are still around. So I've kind of rambled on for a good bit. If you have any questions, happy to hear them.
Thanks, Michael. Okay, we've got time for questions. Yes, sir, right back here. Hold on, wait for the microphone, please.
When did the name Rock Island come into being, and where did it come from?
The Rock Island originally was formed in Illinois and was the original railroad that was built that became the Rock Island Empire was the Rock Island, Illinois. It was originally the Rock Island and LaSalle Railroad, and it slowly expanded over the years, and by the late 1800s, it was part of an aggressive expansion nationwide. The official name for the railroad was the Chicago, Rock Island, and Pacific, but it was nicknamed the Rock Island.
Here.
I noticed on the route map that there was a dead end at Crossett. So I'm assuming that the lumber and pulp industry had a great deal to do with the Rock Island. Can you say something about that relationship?
Yeah, lumber, that was a key commodity in that part of Arkansas, and why it ran. It was essentially a dead end, so through trains weren't going through there, and most of the track in southern Arkansas, it barely got into Louisiana, but they served the railroads. Generally, the crews would come down from Little Rock, go down, service these areas, and then go back. They had connections with other railroads in a lot of these towns, but yeah, the lumber, that was a key commodity. El Dorado, in the 1920s, when oil was discovered there, the Rock Island handled about 90% of the oil that was being sent out at that time. And that El Dorado was a big crew point. In fact, I mentioned the group of retired Rock Island employees here. They have a retired group of employees who gather down there as well.
Yes, sir, got a question back here. Microphone coming at you.
Two questions. First, what happened to the ownership of the rights of way where they tore up the tracks? And then second, do you think that the opening of the Arkansas River barge system affected the fate of the Rock Island, at least here in Arkansas?
I don't know if, If you look in the book, you'll notice that the Rock Island Bridge, they installed a lift span in 1970. There was a big project called the McClellan Kerr Project, which led to the installation of dams on the rivers and the bridges. They had to spend incredible amounts of money to convert them from swing spans that could let narrow vessels by. They had to install lift spans on them. I don't have a lot of specific information about that, but I'm sure expanding that and that as another way to get freight around probably did have an impact. And I'm sorry, what was your first question?
The rights of way now.
The rights of way. That's a good question. For the most part, in a lot of places where the tracks were taken up, they were bought by private owners. Sometimes you had people who owned land right next to the track who would buy the additional right-of-way. There was talk here back in 2009 about taking part of right-of-way that went from Little Rock and down into Benton and turning it into a highway. But people who owned land alongside it opposed that. Many had bought the rights of way. In some cases, even the Union Pacific actually owned the right-of-way between North Little Rock to, I think, Carlisle, which there was a track there, but it actually bought the right-of-way just so that another company couldn't come back in, put rails down, and be a competitor. They wanted to just make sure that they didn't get a competitor. Other places, there are some parts in eastern Arkansas. I think the Nature Conservancy bought some of it, but generally it went into private hands. A lot of the depots, the great thing especially for the track heading east between Little Rock or North Little Rock and Brinkley, you still have most of the depots in the major towns. The Rock Island went right alongside US 70, and the North Little Rock Depot, which was in terrible shape for a long time, it was eventually restored. Lone Oak is in use. The Chamber of Commerce there uses it. Carlisle, you have an insurance company that uses it. Hazen is also used, I believe, by the town for functions. And Brinkley is another story of a depot that really seemed like it was at the end of its life. It was falling in, and it took a big campaign to save the depot at Brinkley, which was actually a junction point. It was that depot was shared by the Rock Island and the Cotton Belt, and it's now a beautiful museum.
I know we've got more questions, but we're also out of time. And I want you all to have plenty of time to come visit with Michael. Let him sign your book. And for those of you with Rock Island, some of you have already told me stories this afternoon. You need to get that information and your contact information to Michael as he continues his great research. Ladies and gentlemen, the Rock Island Railroad in Arkansas, Michael Hibblen.
Thank you.